Hi, I'm Jonathan Carter, a program manager on the Visual Studio team. In this video, we're going to show how you can use Visual Studio Code to build hybrid mobile apps using the Ionic framework. In order to set some context, I'll briefly introduce Visual Studio Code and Ionic. Then, I'll jump into a demo to highlight just how well the two work together. Because I'll be touching on a fair amount of unique libraries, tools, and concepts throughout the demo, I'll finish out the video with a list of resources to ensure that you can follow up on anything you are interested in learning about further. Visual Studio Code is the newest member of the Visual Studio family and brings with it a rich editing experience to developers on both Windows, Linux, and OS X. Now, beyond the traditional editor feature set, it also integrates capabilities like IntelliSense, code navigation, task automation, and even Git support, all of which make it a great environment for developing mobile apps. Ionic is an ecosystem of libraries and tools that make it easy to build hybrid mobile apps using Apache Cordova. Now, in this video, we'll be just focusing on their UI framework controls and their developer CLI, but they have a lot more value and awesomeness that you should check out later. So now that we've set the stage for what Visual Studio Code and Ionic are, let's jump into a demo and see how to use them together. So once you've installed Visual Studio Code and Ionic on your developer machine, all you need to do is create a new Ionic project using their CLI's Ionic start command, and then open up that folder in Visual Studio Code. Here, I've already done that with a brand new project that I'm calling sample. And we can go ahead and start to highlight some of the features that Visual Studio Code has that work really well with the composition of a typical Ionic project. So for example, if we go into the Bower JSON file, you can see immediately that Visual Studio Code is indicating to us that there's an error with this property because it knows that private is supposed to be a Boolean and not a string. So once we make that change, it goes ahead and that error goes away. Now, in addition, if we go and add a new entry to our dev dependencies property here, and we just say control space, you'll notice that we get a list of package names, and that is because Visual Studio Code understands not just the schema of a bower.json file, but also that the property names of a dev dependency entry is dynamically acquired from a remote service, which in this case is the Bower repository. And because it knows that, it's able to give us an auto-completion experience where we can easily add new third-party dependencies to our project. Now, the same experience would work with npm as well in the package JSON file, and you can actually extend it to support other JSON schemas as necessary. Now, beyond JSON files, obviously within a Ionic app, you're going to be editing a lot of JavaScript. So let's go and look for a file called services.js. And this is very idiomatic JavaScript, but immediately you'll see that we're getting a little light bulb and a squiggly at the very top. And what that is Visual Studio Code saying, hey, we can't find the name Angular anywhere. And it's saying that because it wants to give you the best IntelliSense experience possible. Now, if we click this little light bulb and say, add / reference to angular.d.ts file, what that does is it automatically acquires the TypeScript definition for Angular and adds it. And the benefit of that is that we can immediately start to get auto-completion for the entirety of the Angular API, complete with even documentation and type information. And that works because Visual Studio Code understands TypeScript definitions even in JavaScript code, which makes it really easy because the community has generated d.ts files for literally everything. Now, beyond auto-completion, there's also really rich code navigation. So for instance, if we highlight on this chats variable, we can say find all references and immediately see an inline visualization of everywhere that this variable is actually used. So if we double click on one of these, close this inline window, and then do the reverse to say, hey, we actually want to see where chats was defined, you'll notice now that we get the same inline peek experience, but in this case, in being able to see the definition, not the usage of a variable. So there's tons more of these navigation experiences within VS Code, all of which we think add up to a really productive JavaScript editing experience. Now, beyond just JavaScript, we have to do a lot of editing of HTML as well. So if we go and say Control P again, and this time we'll look for a file called chat detail. And once again, this is a traditional Angular Ionic type template. Now, beyond just getting the traditional HTML editing auto-completion that you might expect, so for divs and spans, etc., in addition to the AngularJS support that we just saw in JavaScript, Visual Studio Code's HTML editor also supports auto-completion for all of the core Angular directives out of the box. And this is useful because Ionic is built on top of Angular. So here we see that as soon as we type ng-, we get all of the list of possible core Angular directives, whether it's ng checked, ng bind template, etc. And this way, we don't just have to go with a kind of core baseline HTML experience in an app that we know has higher level semantics, in this case being AngularJS. Now, beyond JavaScript and even HTML, a traditional Ionic app is also built using Sass. And so if we go and we look for a file called _variables.scss this time, we'll see the file that Ionic uses to define all of its variables throughout the whole application. So immediately you'll notice that we get this cool color annotation inline to be able to see what these hex values actually represent. But even cooler, just like we saw in the navigation demo for JavaScript, you can actually do rich navigation on Sass variables, which is one of the more compelling features. So here, if we right-click on this assertive variable and say Find All References, we see exactly what we would expect, all the usages of this variable. If we double-click one, close the peek, and see here, we can then do the reverse and say, actually, you know what, take me to the definition of that, and that takes us back. So you're not just limited to JavaScript for doing navigation on kind of complex code bases, but also Sass as well, which especially when you use variables a lot, that can get useful. So now we've seen kind of the authoring experience. Let's take a look at another cool feature of VS Code that lends itself well to Ionic, and that is task automation. So when you create a project with Ionic and their CLI, they automatically generate a gulp file, which has a handful of useful tasks, one of which is compiling your Sass. Now we could run these tasks from the command line using the gulp CLI, or we can rely on a feature in VS Code to run these directly in the editor. So if we bring up the command palette with Command-Shift-P and say run task, as soon as we do this, it's going to display all the tasks that we have available for us in this project. So if we say Sass, it opens up the output window, and we immediately see the standard out from the process that just generated our Sass into CSS. Really cool. Now, beyond just doing compilation, you can define tasks for literally anything. So here you'll see that we have a task that simply wraps the Ionic serve CLI command into a gulp task that we can run in the editor. So if we say Command-Shift-P again, run task, this time say serve, you'll see the output window will display the output of running that serve command, which will then launch the browser. And in this case, we can start previewing and debugging our application directly within a desktop browser. So finally, one of the other compelling features of VS Code that's integrated directly in is Git support. So here we haven't initialized our repository, so we'll say initialize a new repository. Once that's done, we'll stage all of these files since they're completely new. And then we'll give it a commit message and commit this to our local repo. And we'll say initial commit. And once again, just like with the task automation, we could have done all of this Git work from the command line. And in fact, just to show that that is what VS Code is doing, you can see an output of all of the Git integration that it does. So here it did an initialize on the repo, it added the files, and then it did the commit. But what's great about this option is it allows you to choose when and where you want to turn to the terminal or the command prompt to do certain tasks, and when you would prefer to just not have the extra context switch and stay within your editor for doing core common tasks. So with that, between the authoring, the task automation, and the Git support, we believe that this is why you have a great experience with developing Ionic apps using Visual Studio Code. While we covered many of the features in Visual Studio Code that are relevant to Ionic development, we really only scratched the surface. So, if you would like to look into any of the frameworks or tools that we covered in the video, I've added links to all of them on the resources slide. So we hope that you give VS Code a chance the next time you're building a hybrid mobile app, specifically if you're using Ionic, and we really look forward to hearing any of your feedback. Thank you so much.